I've worked as a commercial boat mechanic for almost 15 years, and I can explain away most things people call paranormal. Strange lights on the water, usually fishing boats or weather conditions, mysterious sounds, birds, seals, shifting rocks, or the wind. People get scared when they're isolated, and fear fills in the blanks. That's exactly what I believed before I accepted a repair job on Blackwater Island in the summer of 2022. The island isn't famous, and I won't reveal its real location because there are still a few families living there seasonally. It's only about 2 miles long, with steep rocky cliffs on one side and a narrow beach on the other. At one time, nearly 40 people lived there, but by the time I arrived, only 3 caretakers stayed through the summer to maintain old vacation homes and keep the docks usable. A storm had damaged the island's backup generator, and the owner of several cottages hired me to repair it. The trip from the mainland took about 90 minutes. The 3 caretakers met me at the dock. There was Neil, a quiet man in his 60s who had spent most of his life on the island. Jacob was in his early 30s, always joking and talking. The 3rd caretaker was Linda, who handled supplies and lived in the only house with satellite internet. They all seemed friendly enough. As Neil helped unload my equipment, he asked an unusual question. "Did anyone explain the radio?" I laughed. "No, should they have?" He looked at Jacob. Jacob immediately interrupted. "Forget it. Neil tells every newcomer the same story." Neil didn't argue. He simply nodded and carried my toolbox toward the generator shed. The first day went smoothly. The storm had flooded part of the generator room, destroying several electrical components. I estimated the repairs would take 2 days if replacement parts worked correctly. That evening, we sat outside eating grilled fish while watching the sun disappear behind the ocean. There wasn't another island in sight, nothing but water in every direction. Jacob pointed toward an old white building near the cliffs. That used to be the radio station. It looked more like a small warehouse than a communications building. "When did it close?" "Late 80s. "Still has equipment inside?" Neil answered before Jacob could. "No." Then he quietly added, "But every now and then, people still hear broadcasts." Jacob sighed. "Here we go again." Neil ignored him. "Don't go inside that building after dark." I smiled politely, assuming it was just another local legend meant to entertain visitors. Around 11 that night, I went to sleep in one of the empty cottages. At exactly 3:18 a.m., I woke to the sound of static. At first I thought it was rain. Then I realized it was coming from somewhere inside the cottage. I followed the sound into the kitchen. An old portable radio sat on the counter. It wasn't plugged in. There were no batteries inside, yet it was making loud bursts of static. Then a man's voice came through. "Can anyone hear me?" The signal faded. "Please answer." Then silence. The radio went completely dead. The next morning I asked Linda who had left the radio in my cottage. She looked confused. There wasn't supposed to be one in there. Neil didn't look surprised at all. He only asked one question. "What time?" 3:18. He slowly nodded. "Same as always." I thought they were playing some elaborate prank. The repair work continued without problems. Around noon, I needed a replacement cable stored inside the abandoned radio station. Neil reluctantly gave me the key. "Get what you need and come back." The building smelled of damp wood and rust. Most of the equipment had been removed decades earlier. Only empty shelves and broken desks remained. Near the back wall, I found an old logbook. Out of curiosity, I opened it. The final page was dated August 14th, 1988. The last handwritten entry read, "Receiving repeated distress calls from unknown source. Signal does not match any registered vessel. Transmission repeats every night at 3:18 a.m. Coast Guard reports nothing in our area." Underneath that sentence, someone had scribbled over the page so heavily that the paper had nearly torn. As I closed the book, I heard footsteps upstairs. I assumed one of the caretakers had come looking for me. "Neil?" No response. The footsteps stopped. I walked upstairs. Nobody. Every room was empty. When I came back downstairs, the logbook had somehow fallen onto the floor. I picked it up and left. That night, Jacob knocked on my cottage door. "You awake?" "Yeah." He looked embarrassed. "I know Neil tells weird stories, but if you hear someone asking for help on the radio tonight, don't answer." I laughed. "You seriously believe this stuff?" "No." He paused. "I just don't answer anymore." He walked away before I could ask why. I stayed awake intentionally. At exactly 3:18, the radio turned on again. Static. Then, "Blackwater Station. This is fishing vessel Caroline. We've lost power. Can anyone hear us?" The voice sounded terrified. I knew enough about radios to recognize genuine panic. Instinctively, I reached toward the microphone sitting beside the radio. Just before I pressed the transmit button, someone knocked violently on my door. It was Neil. "Don't answer it." I opened the door. "There's someone asking for help." Neil grabbed the radio and switched it off. "No." He stared directly at me. "There's nobody out there." The next morning, he finally explained. Back in 1988, a fishing boat named Caroline had disappeared during heavy fog. The Coast Guard searched for nearly a week. No wreckage, no bodies, nothing. According to official reports, the last confirmed radio contact occurred around midnight, not 3:18. The strange broadcast supposedly didn't begin until several nights after the search had already ended. Every operator who answered the distress call claimed the people on the radio could hear them clearly. But whenever rescue crews searched the reported coordinates, there was never anything there. Eventually, the station stopped responding altogether. The nightly broadcast continued for several months before suddenly ending, or so everyone thought. Neil claimed they eventually returned years later. Only now, anyone staying on the island could hear them. I still believe there had to be a technical explanation. Old frequencies, atmospheric interference, something. On my final day, the generator repairs were completed. The supply boat was scheduled for late afternoon. With several hours to spare, I decided to inspect the old radio tower one last time. It stood about 50 yards behind the abandoned station. The metal staircase had mostly rusted away. Near the base of the tower, I found something strange. A small emergency life ring. Its faded lettering read, "Caroline." It looked old, very old. The strange part was that it wasn't weathered enough to have been lying there for over 30 years. It looked as though someone had placed it there recently. That evening, heavy fog rolled over the island much faster than forecast. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The supply boat radioed that they couldn't safely approach until morning. Nobody complained. Instead, everyone quietly went indoors before sunset. Around midnight, I stepped outside. The fog had become so thick, I couldn't even see the neighboring cottage. The ocean sounded unusually close. Then, I heard an engine, not from a dock, from somewhere offshore, a small diesel engine. It sputtered exactly like an old fishing boat. Then came voices, several people shouting over each other. "Throw the rope! This way! We're taking on water!" The sounds grew louder. I ran toward the beach. The voices were only a few hundred feet away. I could hear waves crashing against what sounded like a wooden hull. Yet, I couldn't see anything, not even lights. Suddenly, someone screamed, "Help us!" The voice was so close it felt like the person was standing just beyond the fog. Without thinking, I stepped into the shallow water. Another step, then another. Behind me, Neil yelled my name. I turned. He and Jacob were sprinting toward me carrying flashlights. Neil grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. "What are you doing? There's a boat." "There isn't." As soon as he said that, the engine stopped. Every voice disappeared. The ocean became completely silent. The next morning, the fog cleared. There wasn't a single boat anywhere around the island. No fresh tracks, no floating debris, nothing. The supply boat finally arrived. As we loaded my equipment, I noticed Jacob wasn't joking anymore. He looked exhausted. Before we left, he handed me a folded newspaper clipping. "Read it after you get home." I forgot about it until later that evening. The article described the disappearance of the fishing vessel Caroline. 23 people had been aboard. At the bottom of the page was a photograph of the crew taken just before departure. One face immediately caught my attention. The captain. I recognized him. He was the same man whose voice I had heard through the radio, asking if anyone could hear him. I know memory can play tricks on people. I understand that. But I can still hear his voice perfectly. 3 months later, curiosity got the better of me. I searched online for recordings of old maritime radio traffic. Eventually, I found an archive maintained by amateur radio enthusiasts. One recording was labeled only, "Unknown Distress Signal, August 1988. I pressed play. Static filled the speakers. Then the exact same terrified voice said, "Blackwater Station, this is Caroline. We've lost power." I froze, because halfway through the recording, a second voice answered. It wasn't from the radio station. It wasn't from the Coast Guard. It wasn't anyone from 1988. It was mine, calm, confused, asking one question. "Can anyone tell me where you are?" I had never answered that radio. Neil stopped me before I touched the microphone. I know that happened. I remember it as clearly as any other day of my life. But somehow, 34 years before I ever visited that island, my voice was already part of the transmission. I deleted the recording immediately. I haven't searched for it again. Sometimes I wonder if the broadcasts aren't recordings at all. Maybe they're conversations. Maybe time behaves differently in certain places, especially out on the open water where nobody is around to notice. Or maybe the island is still listening for anyone willing to answer. Either way, if you ever find yourself on a remote island and an old radio comes to life in the middle of the night with someone begging for help, do yourself a favor. Turn it off, because some distress calls aren't waiting to be rescued. I never believed in ghost stories. I worked as a marine equipment technician, traveling to remote islands whenever research teams needed someone to repair generators, radios, or satellite systems. Most of the places I visited were beautiful during the day and unsettling at night, but I always blamed the isolation, strange sounds, and lack of electricity for making people imagine things. That changed 4 years ago. I don't usually tell this story because I know how unbelievable it sounds. The only reason I'm sharing it now is because I recently found an old photo from that trip, and I noticed something in the background that I somehow missed for years. In late September, I received a call from a small marine research station located on an island about 3 hours from the mainland. There were only 6 people living there permanently, studying sea turtles and coral reefs. Their communication equipment had stopped working after a tropical storm, and they needed someone to repair it before another storm arrived. The job was supposed to take 2 days. A supply boat dropped me off shortly after noon. The island was small enough to walk across in about 40 minutes. Thick tropical trees covered most of it, while the research buildings stood near the shore. There was also an abandoned lighthouse on the northern cliffs that hadn't been used in decades. The station manager, Ethan, greeted me with a tired smile. "You'll probably hear some strange stories tonight," he joked. "Just ignore them." I laughed. "Let me guess. Ghost lighthouse?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the ocean before saying quietly, "Something like that." The first day was completely normal. I repaired the damaged antenna, replaced several cables, and restored their satellite connection before sunset. Everyone seemed relieved. That evening, we all had dinner together. There were 6 researchers besides me: Ethan, Maya, Chris, Olivia, Ben, and Sophia. The conversation stayed light until the power briefly flickered. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Finally, Ben sighed. "I heard it again last night." The table became silent. I asked what he meant. He looked embarrassed. "The footsteps." Chris rolled his eyes. "It's probably crabs." Ben shook his head. "Crabs don't walk around someone's cabin at 2 in the morning." Nobody laughed. Instead, Maya quietly changed the subject. Later that night, I walked back to the guest cabin assigned to me. The island was almost completely dark except for a few solar-powered lights. The ocean sounded unusually loud. Around midnight, I woke up because someone was walking outside. Slow, heavy, crunch, crunch, crunch. It sounded like wet boots crossing gravel. I checked my phone. 2:11 a.m. The footsteps circled my cabin once, then they stopped outside my window. I waited. Nothing. After almost a minute, I pulled back the curtain. Nobody was there. The flashlight near the walkway illuminated the entire area. Empty. I figured one of the researchers had gone outside. The next morning, I asked if anyone had been walking around late at night. Every single person said no. Ben looked uncomfortable. What time? About 2. He quietly pushed his breakfast away. That's when they usually come. Nobody explained what he meant. That afternoon, I decided to explore the island while waiting for the supply boat scheduled the following morning. Eventually, I reached the abandoned lighthouse. Its white paint had almost completely peeled away, and vines covered the entrance. Inside were rusted stairs leading upward. Near the base of the staircase, I found several old photographs scattered across the floor. Most had been ruined by moisture. One picture was still clear enough to recognize. It showed 4 lighthouse keepers standing outside the building sometime in the 1950s. 3 were smiling. The 4th man wasn't. Someone had written on the back, "Never answer the knocking after the tide returns." I assumed it was some local superstition. That evening, dark clouds rolled in earlier than expected. The supply boat radioed that rough seas would delay pickup until the following afternoon. Nobody seemed happy about it. Dinner ended early. Around 10 p.m., the power failed completely. The backup generator wouldn't start. The entire station disappeared into darkness. We each carried flashlights back to our cabins. I fell asleep surprisingly fast. Then, knock, knock, knock. 3 slow knocks. I sat upright. Someone was outside. "Hello?" No answer. Another 3 knocks. Then a voice. "Daniel." It sounded exactly like Ethan. "Can you come outside?" I reached for the door. Then I remembered something. Ethan's cabin was over 100 feet away. Why wouldn't he simply call my phone? I checked it. No signal. The voice came again. "Daniel, hurry." I stayed silent. After nearly 30 seconds, the voice stopped. Then the footsteps began. Crunch, crunch, crunch. They slowly walked away. The next morning, I immediately asked Ethan if he'd come to my cabin. His face went pale. I told everyone never to answer if someone calls your name outside after dark. I stared at him. "You've experienced this before?" He nodded. My predecessor warned me when I first arrived. According to him, strange voices had been reported on the island for decades. Always after storms, always at night, always asking people to come outside. A former researcher disappeared 12 years earlier after supposedly hearing his wife's voice calling from the beach. His wife had actually been hundreds of miles away. Search teams found only his flashlight near the shoreline. Nothing else. I still wasn't convinced. Maybe someone had developed hallucinations from stress. Maybe sounds traveled strangely across the island. There had to be an explanation. That afternoon, I packed my equipment. The weather looked calm enough for the supply boat. We waited at the dock. 3 o'clock came. No boat. The radio crackled with static before finally receiving a message. Engine trouble. They wouldn't arrive until the next morning. Nobody said anything. We all simply walked back. That night, Ethan insisted everyone stay inside after sunset. At exactly 1:47 a.m., the footsteps returned. Not just outside my cabin, outside every cabin. Crunch, crunch, crunch. They moved slowly around the entire research station. I could hear doors opening, people shouting, flashlights switching on, then complete silence. After several minutes, Ethan yelled from inside his cabin, "Nobody leave your room!" Immediately afterward, someone screamed. A woman's voice. It sounded like Sophia. The scream stopped abruptly. Then everything became quiet again. I waited until sunrise before opening my door. Every researcher stepped outside at nearly the same moment. Everyone was there, including Sophia. She looked confused. I heard myself screaming. Nobody spoke. Then Chris pointed toward the beach. There were footprints, hundreds of them, all leading inland, none leading back toward the ocean. The strange thing wasn't the number, it was the shape. Every footprint looked human. Except they only had 4 toes. Later that morning, the supply boat finally arrived. None of us argued about leaving. As we pulled away from the island, I looked back one last time. 6 people stood near the abandoned lighthouse, watching us. I assumed they were the researchers. Then Ethan counted everyone aboard, including himself, including all 5 researchers. Everyone was already on the boat. There should have been nobody left on the island. I turned around again. The cliff was empty. I convinced myself I'd imagined it. For years, I managed to forget the entire experience. Until last month. While cleaning out an old hard drive, I found pictures from that trip. Most were ordinary. The cabins, the dock, the lighthouse. Then I opened the group photo we took before leaving. 7 of us stood smiling in front of the research station. Me, Ethan, Maya, Chris, Olivia, Ben, Sophia. At first, everything looked normal. Then I zoomed into one of the cabin windows behind us. There was someone standing inside, watching us. A pale man wearing old lighthouse keeper clothes. His face was impossible to make out because of the reflection. I assumed I'd photographed one of the researchers by accident, so I contacted Ethan. He replied the next day. He said only one sentence. That cabin has been locked since the station was built. Nobody has a key. I never answered him. I deleted every picture from that trip except that one. Sometimes I open it just to convince myself I'm remembering things correctly. Every single time, I notice something different. Sometimes the figure is closer to the window. Sometimes it seems farther away. Once, I could have sworn it wasn't standing at the window anymore. It was outside, near the lighthouse, watching whoever happened to be looking at the photograph. I haven't opened the file again. Some memories are easier to live with when you stop checking whether they've changed.